Daniel Mercer never imagined that something as ordinary as a driveway could completely change the direction of his life. But he eventually discovered that the first things people try to take away are often the smallest pieces of what belongs to you, long before they come after everything else. It all began on a Thursday evening when he returned to his home in Cedar Ridge Estates after finishing a long double shift at the manufacturing plant. He was exhausted in the kind of way that settles deep into your bones, where even your own thoughts feel too heavy to carry. As always, he turned onto his street expecting to see the same worn but dependable concrete driveway that had welcomed him home for the past 25 years. Instead, he froze. The driveway was completely gone. In its place was nothing but loose dirt, deep tire tracks, and an empty patch of ground that his mind refused to accept. It was not cracked, partially broken, or under repair. It had been entirely removed, as if someone had erased a piece of his life without leaving a trace. For several long moments he remained seated in his truck with the engine still idling, convincing himself he had somehow driven to the wrong address or that exhaustion was clouding his judgment. Then his eyes caught the sharp edges where the concrete had been neatly cut apart, broken up with heavy equipment, and hauled away. That was when reality settled in. Someone had deliberately done this while he was away at work. He stepped out of the truck slowly, his boots pressing into the loose soil where solid concrete had always been. What struck him most was the silence. There was no familiar crunch of gravel beneath his feet, no firm surface, only a strange emptiness that made the entire property feel unfamiliar. The porch light still glowed softly, humming the same way it always had, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet everything had changed. That driveway had existed longer than many of the families living nearby. He had poured every section of it beside his father back when the neighborhood was still surrounded by farmland and hopeful dreams, years before security gates, HOA regulations, and endless restrictions convinced people that they had to keep proving they deserved to own their own property. He stood there for what felt like forever trying to understand what he was looking at before noticing something else. A laminated notice had been pushed into the dirt with a metal stake, standing upright like a grave marker. He pulled it free and read it beneath the porch light, almost expecting someone to laugh and explain it was all some elaborate prank. Instead, the message simply read, "Non-compliant driveway surface. Remove and replace with approved material within 30 days." The phrase non-compliant echoed through Daniel's thoughts again and again because it reduced years of hard work into nothing more than an administrative mistake waiting to be corrected. He let out a short laugh, not because there was anything amusing about the situation, but because laughing felt easier than accepting what had happened. Looking around at the empty space where his driveway used to be, he muttered aloud, "You've got to be kidding me." What kind of people arrived while someone was away earning a living and decided they had the authority to remove part of another person's property as though it had never belonged there? His pickup truck now sat awkwardly with half of it sticking into the street, hazard lights flashing bright orange across the loose dirt that had replaced the path connecting his home to the road. Inside, he felt something beginning to change. It was not rage, at least not yet. It was a slow, unsettling realization that this had not been a mistake or an unfortunate misunderstanding. Someone wanted him to receive a message, and this was how they chose to deliver it. The following morning, coffee in hand, Daniel walked slowly along the edge of his property, trying his best to stay calm. He kept telling himself there had to be a reasonable explanation hidden somewhere. But every step only made the truth harder to ignore. Every neighboring house still had its matching brick-pattern driveway perfectly intact, lined up with flawless precision like photographs in a real estate brochure. His was the only one missing, the only property reduced to bare earth. It looked targeted rather than accidental. As he stood there, he noticed details he had ignored for years. Every mailbox matched. Every house was painted nearly the same color. Every hedge had been trimmed to an identical height. The neighborhood no longer felt like a place where real people lived. Instead, it resembled a carefully managed display where individuality had slowly disappeared. Then he spotted Mrs. Linda Hargrove standing across the street with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. She watched him quietly, almost as though she had been waiting for the exact moment he stepped outside. There was no urgency in her expression and certainly no sympathy. She simply observed him with calm confidence. Daniel immediately understood she had not come to explain anything. Whatever decision had been made had already happened without his knowledge or approval. She crossed the street at an unhurried pace, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years giving orders without expecting anyone to challenge them. When she reached him, she spoke his name in the same detached tone someone might use while checking attendance from a list. "Mr. Mercer, we issued multiple notices regarding your driveway surface compliance." Daniel stared at her, struggling to understand how a slab of concrete that had served its purpose for decades could suddenly require anyone's approval. It had faithfully done exactly what every driveway was meant to do for over 25 years without causing problems for anyone. He asked her the only question that mattered. "Where is my driveway?" She answered immediately without the slightest hesitation. According to her, it had been removed because of a compliance violation and would have to be replaced with materials approved by the Homeowners Association if he wished to restore compliance. Her voice remained perfectly steady, almost robotic, as though she were discussing lawn maintenance instead of the destruction of part of someone's home. Daniel explained that the driveway had existed years before the HOA had ever been created. He told her he had poured the concrete himself beside his father, and that it represented family history rather than decorative landscaping. Linda looked back at him with quiet impatience, as if his memories carried no weight against the rulebook she held in her hands. To her, the past simply did not matter if it failed to fit the standards currently being enforced. She tapped her clipboard once before calmly replying, "We understand your emotional attachment, but rules are rules." Those few words landed harder than Daniel expected. They were spoken so casually, so completely stripped of compassion, that they revealed something far more disturbing than the missing driveway itself. It felt as though the people running the HOA had trained themselves to stop seeing homeowners as human beings. Instead, they only recognized violations, paperwork, and regulations. That evening, Daniel lay awake in bed, unable to quiet his thoughts. Every detail of the confrontation replayed endlessly in his mind, from the empty patch of dirt outside his home to Linda's emotionless explanation. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the destroyed driveway was only the beginning. Someone had crossed a line they never should have touched, and deep inside, Daniel knew the story was far from over. The image of my driveway being ripped apart and hauled away like a pile of worthless debris stayed burned into my mind. What hurt the most was not even losing the concrete itself. It was knowing that somewhere, people had sat around a table, discussed it, voted in favor of it, signed the paperwork, and carried it out while I was simply at work believing everything at home was exactly as I had left it. The following morning, I began sorting through old files and documents, driven by equal parts anger and instinct. Something about the way Mrs. Hargrove had spoken made me feel this had never really been about appearance or neighborhood standards. That uneasy feeling pushed me to keep searching until I uncovered something my grandfather had carefully preserved for decades. It was an easement agreement between our property and the regional utility company, written long before Cedar Ridge Estates had even been imagined. Buried within the legal wording was a section I had never paid much attention to before. It outlined permanent access rights for underground electrical infrastructure crossing my land, including the transformer that supplied electricity to the entire eastern side of the neighborhood. At first, it meant very little to me. It looked like ordinary legal language, the kind most people skim without thinking twice. Then a memory surfaced. I pictured the utility cabinet sitting just beyond where my driveway had always been and the faded cable markers stretching beneath the exact area the excavation crews had torn apart. Suddenly, this was no longer just about missing concrete. If they had dug through that section without proper precautions, they might have disturbed equipment they had absolutely no business interfering with. They could have exposed something that belonged not only to me, but to the electrical system serving hundreds of homes. I stood in my kitchen holding those papers, realizing this had grown into something much larger than an argument with an HOA. This was a collision between careless authority and critical infrastructure, and neither side of the board seemed to understand what they had walked into. I still kept the discovery to myself. I did not call anyone or threaten legal action. Instead, I quietly sat with the information, letting its importance sink in. Once you truly understand what lies beneath your property, you stop looking at the ground above it the same way. That realization marked the point where everything quietly began to change. Even though I had not made a single move yet, sleep barely came that night. It was not fear that kept me awake. My thoughts simply refused to settle, circling around the same discovery over and over like a key searching for the right lock. By sunrise, I was standing once again where my driveway had once stretched, a mug of coffee warming my hands while the early morning light spread across the freshly disturbed dirt. It almost seemed as if the empty ground was revealing something that had always been hidden in plain sight. From a distance, Cedar Ridge Estates looked exactly as it always had. The streets were peaceful, the grass neatly trimmed, and every neighboring home displayed the same matching brick-pattern driveways lined up with almost mechanical precision. Yet I could no longer ignore the difference. Their perfect order stood in sharp contrast to the empty scar on my property. My driveway had not simply disappeared with age. Someone had intentionally erased it, scraping away years of history as though it had never deserved to exist. Later that morning, I spotted Mrs. Hargrove again. This time she was accompanied by 2 other HOA board members, all 3 walking together with the confidence of people convinced they controlled everything around them. Before they even reached my property, I could tell they had already agreed on exactly what story they intended to tell. Mrs. Hargrove stopped just short of the exposed dirt, avoiding it as though stepping onto it might somehow lower her authority. Looking directly at me, she calmly said, "Mr. Mercer, we are still operating within our enforcement procedures. Your replacement deadline remains 30 days. I laughed again, but this laugh carried no humor. It was the sound of disbelief hardening into determination. I asked her plainly who had authorized the demolition because enforcing a regulation was one thing, but physically destroying a permanent structure on private property without permission was something entirely different. She never hesitated. She answered that the board had officially declared the driveway a hazard and approved its removal through a majority vote. The word hazard lodged itself in my thoughts because it was exactly the kind of label people used whenever they wanted to justify ignoring someone else's ownership rights. One of the other board members, Nolan Pierce, stepped forward and added that the community standards had recently been updated. According to him, older concrete driveways created inconsistencies that could negatively affect neighborhood property values, as though my 25-year-old driveway had suddenly become a financial threat instead of a dependable piece of concrete that had served its purpose without complaint for decades. I looked past the 3 of them toward the row of identical driveways lining the street and asked a simple question. Were they planning to tear out everyone else's driveways too? Or had mine simply become the experiment? Before anyone answered, I caught the brief hesitation that crossed their faces. It lasted only a second, but sometimes silence reveals more truth than words ever can. Mrs. Hargrove finally replied, "Mr. Mercer, your circumstances are unique because of your previous notice history." It sounded polished, carefully rehearsed, and deliberately vague. What she really meant was obvious. They believed I was the easiest homeowner to pressure instead of someone worth negotiating with. That evening, I spread the easement documents across my dining room table once more. This time I slowed down, reading every sentence with complete attention. Eventually, I found the clause I had overlooked before. It described not only the access rights to the underground utility system, but also the responsibility to maintain safe conditions above the buried infrastructure at all times. That was when everything finally connected. The transformer located on my property was not just another utility box blending into the background. It was the primary distribution point supplying electricity to multiple sections of Cedar Ridge Estates. The easement did far more than grant workers permission to enter my land. It required that the surface above those underground systems remain protected and undisturbed. In that moment, I understood something the HOA clearly did not. By tearing out my driveway without understanding what lay beneath it, they might have placed the neighborhood's entire electrical network at risk, and that single mistake had the potential to change everything. The more I studied the documents, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Whoever had ordered the demolition had not simply removed a driveway. They had disturbed a protected easement area that was never supposed to be excavated without proper authorization and oversight. If those underground utility lines had been damaged, The power company would not care about HOA policies, neighborhood appearances, or board approvals. Their only concern would be public safety and determining who was responsible. I still resisted making any calls, not because I doubted what I had found, but because I wanted absolute certainty before setting events in motion. Once a utility company becomes involved in a situation like that, there is no easy way to undo it. No emergency meeting, neighborhood vote, or carefully worded statement can change the physical reality beneath the ground. The final confirmation came the following morning when I noticed something I had overlooked before. The air carried the distinct smell of freshly disturbed soil mixed with that faint metallic scent that often lingers around exposed electrical equipment. Near the transformer cabinet, I spotted an area where the excavation had clearly gone much deeper than necessary. It looked rushed and careless, as though the workers believed they were only removing concrete instead of digging above critical infrastructure. At that moment, I stopped hesitating. I picked up my phone and called the utility company's emergency number. Even now, I remember how calm my voice sounded as I explained that unauthorized excavation had taken place on my property, directly above a documented utility easement, and that I needed an immediate safety inspection. The operator asked several routine questions, but the moment I confirmed that I was the recorded easement holder, the entire conversation changed. It was no longer treated as a homeowner's complaint. It had instantly become a potential threat to the electrical system. Less than an hour later, a utility truck arrived, and 2 technicians carefully examined the exposed ground. They moved slowly around the site, taking photographs, checking instruments, and quietly discussing what they were seeing. The longer they remained, the more serious their expressions became. Finally, one technician looked at me and explained that they would have to isolate the affected electrical line until a complete investigation could be completed. I did not need him to explain what that meant because I already sensed the impact it was about to have on the entire neighborhood. By early afternoon, sections of Cedar Ridge estates began losing power. It did not happen all at once. Instead, one area after another slowly went dark, almost as though someone was lowering the brightness across the entire community. At first, everyone assumed it was an ordinary power outage that would be fixed within minutes. But the lights stayed off and the atmosphere quickly changed. From my porch, I watched neighbors step outside looking confused, checking their phones, calling across perfectly trimmed lawns that had always reflected order and control. Those same immaculate yards were now filled with uncertainty instead of quiet confidence. I will admit something that is difficult to explain. What I felt was not satisfaction or revenge. The anger that had consumed me during the previous days had faded into something quieter. It felt like watching unavoidable consequences unfold after choices had already been made. Later that evening, Mrs. Hargrove returned, and for the first time since this all began, she arrived without her clipboard. Oddly enough, that small detail told me more than anything she could have said. She asked what I had done, not with open accusation but with genuine confusion, as though she was trying to understand a chain of events she no longer controlled. I calmly replied that I had done nothing beyond reporting unsafe conditions on my own property after discovering exposed utility infrastructure beneath an unauthorized excavation. She responded by insisting they had only been replacing a driveway, as though that explanation still made sense after everything unfolding around us. I slowly shook my head because it finally became obvious that the board truly had no understanding of what they had disturbed. That night, half the neighborhood remained dark while the other half stayed illuminated. Portable generators appeared outside homes one after another, filling the evening air with a steady mechanical hum. Sitting in my kitchen, I listened to that sound drifting through the open window and thought about how quickly a carefully controlled system begins falling apart when it is built on assumptions instead of knowledge. For the first time since my driveway disappeared, I stopped thinking about what had been taken away from me. Instead, I realized something much larger had been uncovered. The third morning carried a completely different feeling the moment I stepped outside. Nothing dramatic had changed visually, yet the neighborhood no longer possessed the polished silence it had always worn so proudly. There was uncertainty in the air now, as though the entire community had lost confidence in itself. Some houses briefly regained electricity before losing it again, while others remained completely dark. Across Cedar Ridge estates, Generators continued humming at irregular intervals like scattered mechanical heartbeats struggling to keep everyday life moving. I stood beside the same empty stretch of dirt where my driveway had once been, staring at the exposed ground that quietly reminded me this situation had never truly started with the utility company. It had started the moment someone convinced themselves they had the right to treat another person's property as negotiable. Around mid-morning, I noticed Mrs. Hargrove walking toward my house once again. But this time she was alone. There were no fellow board members beside her and no clipboard tucked under her arm. She moved more slowly than before, looking as though the previous 2 days had aged her far beyond their passing. It was obvious she had rehearsed whatever speech she planned to deliver, yet she also seemed to know it would never have the effect she wanted. When she reached the edge of the disturbed ground, she did something she had refused to do before. She stepped directly onto the dirt without hesitation, as though the invisible line she had once respected no longer mattered. Looking at me, she quietly said, "Mr. Mercer, we need to resolve this. The board is willing to rebuild your driveway exactly as it was. Full replacement, complete approval, full compliance, whatever you want. We just need your cooperation so power restoration can move forward." I held her gaze for several long seconds before saying anything. In that silence, it became clear that the balance of power had completely shifted. The people who had once spoken only about rules were now asking for understanding, and they finally realized they needed something only I could provide. I stood there for a long moment before answering because what stayed with me was not her apology or even the urgency in her voice. It was the speed with which absolute confidence had transformed into negotiation. Just days earlier, the board had spoken as though every decision was final and unquestionable. Now they were asking instead of ordering. I calmly explained that I had never authorized the power interruption, nor had I created the dangerous situation. All I had done was report unsafe conditions on my own property under a legally established utility easement. If the neighborhood's electrical infrastructure could not withstand a proper legal and safety review, that responsibility did not belong to me. Mrs. Hargrove tried to defend the board's actions, insisting the demolition crew had been instructed to work carefully and that everything had simply been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Before she could continue, I asked one simple question. Who told them to dig that deep? She froze for a brief moment because we both already knew the answer, even if neither of us spoke it aloud. That silence revealed more than any explanation could have. I have learned that when people stop defending what they did and begin defending what they meant to do, they usually understand the consequences are no longer under their control. Later that afternoon, a representative from the utility company returned, this time dressed more formally and carrying official paperwork. He explained that the excavation had indeed crossed into a protected easement area and violated required safety standards. Until engineers completed their structural assessment and determined legal responsibility, the company could not restore full electrical service to the affected portions of the neighborhood. He chose his words carefully, but the message was unmistakable. This had moved far beyond an HOA disagreement. It had become a matter of legal compliance, infrastructure protection, and liability, issues that could never be settled through neighborhood meetings or board votes. That evening, I sat quietly on my porch watching the sky fade into the soft gray light before sunset. In the distance, the steady hum of generators echoed through the neighborhood. As I listened, I realized how fragile everything around us really was. For years, Cedar Ridge Estates had appeared solid and permanent, but in truth that stability had existed only because everyone agreed to believe in it. Once that agreement broke apart, everything hidden beneath the surface became impossible to ignore. The following morning, Mrs. Hargrove came back once again, but this visit felt entirely different from the others. She carried a folder instead of her usual clipboard, and there was no attempt to hide behind formal procedures or rehearsed explanations. She immediately explained that the board had voted to restore my driveway exactly as it had originally been built. They would honor the grandfathered specifications, waive every HOA material requirement, cover every construction expense, and pay for any damage resulting from the demolition. She also informed me that the board intended to publish a formal written apology on the community website acknowledging what had happened. Hearing those words felt almost unreal. It was like watching a machine that had spent years refusing to bend suddenly realize flexibility was the only thing that could prevent it from breaking apart completely. I told her I would accept the proposal, but only under 3 very clear conditions, and I spoke slowly enough that nothing could be misunderstood. First, my driveway had to be rebuilt exactly as it had existed before, with no unnecessary redesigns or decorative upgrades. Second, the board had to provide written acknowledgement that demolishing it had been unauthorized and improperly carried out on my private property. Third, they had to reimburse every cost connected to the damage caused by exposing the underground utility infrastructure. None of this had ever been about replacing concrete. It had always been about accepting responsibility for actions that should never have happened. Mrs. Hargrove did not argue or negotiate. She quietly nodded, signed the agreement right there in front of me, and handed me the paperwork. Looking at her face, I could tell she finally understood that authority alone could not solve this situation. The only path forward was accepting the consequences of the board's own decisions. A week later, new construction crews arrived, completely different from the ones who had removed the original driveway. They carefully rebuilt everything exactly as it had been before. Plain concrete, no decorative patterns, no forced upgrades, and no attempt to make it match some HOA-approved design. They simply restored what had always belonged there. I stood nearby watching them work, thinking about how something as ordinary as a driveway could carry so much meaning once it had been taken away. Gradually, the neighborhood settled back into its routine. Electricity returned to every house, the generators disappeared one by one, and daily life slowly resumed. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. Everyone now understood that the rules they enforced so confidently had limits they had never bothered to understand. Mrs. Hargrove never knocked on my door again, and I never expected her to. Whatever authority she once believed was unquestionable had quietly been rewritten by events beyond her control. Even now, I sometimes stand outside in the evening looking at that driveway and think about how easily this entire situation could have ended with nothing more than another compliance notice tossed into a drawer and forgotten. Instead, someone crossed a boundary they never realized existed, and that invisible line turned out to be connected to far more than anyone had imagined. If this experience taught me anything, it is that people often mistake control for stability, and communities like Cedar Ridge Estates depend on that illusion more than they realize. Once that illusion disappears, the truth underneath becomes impossible to ignore. I know some people believe I took things too far, while others insist I simply defended what was rightfully mine. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between those two opinions. It depends on what property ownership means to you and how far you believe someone should go to protect it. If you have ever faced an HOA dispute or watched something similar happen in your own neighborhood, I would genuinely like to hear your story. After everything that happened, I have a feeling experiences like mine are far more common than most people are willing to admit.